Dave. Welcome back. We're going to do another episode here.
All right.
Okay. In a previous episode, you had mentioned people with skills and the right tools when we were talking about lumber sizing, rough to surfaced. They could actually buy rough lumber and they could take it all the way down to surfaced, finished, usable product for their job. So I caught my eye, for one, great appreciation for that kind of skill set. That's quite impressive. But in one of our previous conversations, you also talked about prepping the lumber. And I didn't really think about it, but you said, hey, there can be steel in it, or there could be buckshot, or there could be somebody drove a spike into the tree and then somehow it ends up in a rough form that you just bought because you know how to calculate board measure. You just bought properly and brought to your shop. Can you talk about prepping the lumber before you even want to think about putting it on the tools?
Well, for nominal lumber, we don't usually prep. Okay. For one thing, it would be lovely to have, let's say it's a 2x6 exterior wall, and take all of them and run it through a track saw. Okay. But by the time that 2x6 wall would not be 5.5, it would be a lot smaller. There are certain things that we know are going to happen. We know the wood's going to cup. That's just going to have to happen. And we know it'll cup to the outside of the tree. But when you get other growth stresses like twists or crooks or bows, then for the cabinet maker, boat builder, for anyone that can work up with rough wood, they would then have a certain litany of what they do to flatten, straighten, and come up with S4S. In other words, they make their own S4S. But when I go to Dunn Lumber, I buy S4S.
Okay.
So the steps normally, and you're exactly right, if there are any inclusions in the wood and you run it through your tooling, you will spend a few hours swearing at the tooling while you have to take apart the knives, and hopefully you can salvage the tool. Mm-hmm. We've seen that happen, not so much with bullets, they're pretty soft, but like buckshot or the other thing again, this is the West, so it was oftentimes you'd have barbed wire wrapped around a tree, and the tree would grow over it.
Yeah.
And then when you put that through the planer. So one of the steps in a sawmill is they actually take a big magnetometer and they actually look for any kind of metal, and they have someone that digs the metal out of the log before it goes to the head saw. You can imagine what it would do to a head saw. So that kind of thing is really important. We don't see it very often. We do see it sometimes. Okay. But the cleaning of the wood is the first thing, and this is what we always tell the students. The classic now are just some staples. So what happened is, at the lumberyard, they stapled a bunch of covering on it. They had whatever they had, but you'll often see the staples in the end. And if they run that through our saws, that can be a problem. All the saws at our institution are saw stops. And what they're looking for is anything conductive, which could be your finger, okay? So if it hits a bit of metal, that saw stop cartridge will eject, and the blade is ruined and the cartridge is ruined. So the first thing I tell the students is, not just for the protection of your tools, protection of yourself, make sure the wood is clean.
Yeah.
Okay?
So how do you know if there's some steel or metal inside the board that you can't see? Do you have a way to,
that's a
in
hard
a shop
one.
environment, or you just kind of,
A lot of times if you take a light pass on a joiner, okay, which will clean up a face or something, if you start seeing some dark staining, sometimes that's what's there, what's underneath.
Iron stain, yeah.
But honestly, you don't. Now, I know that some of the woodworking stores actually do sell magnetic detectors, and they scan their wood. We haven't gone to that extent yet, but it may come to that.
Okay, Interesting. All right, so I'm down with you at the shop, and we've got whatever, some 8-quarter, what have you, and you're gonna clean it up and make me a surface piece of wood I can take home and stain and use.
So what's the process, right?
Well, yeah, basically, what tools are you going to use, and what's the order of that process?
Well, the first step that we say after cleaning the wood, okay, is it's a combination. You're looking at the wood at the same time, but you're kind of laying out your pieces that you're going to use. So maybe you want to feature that knot, or maybe you want to eliminate that knot. So you're kind of inspecting for grain. If the grain is running off very steeply, that's going to be a more challenging board to actually edge your face joint to. So, some of the challenges, you're just going to have to slow down your pass, and you're going to have to take a very light pass.
Okay.
So the combination of the two, basically ripping and cross-cutting to a manageable size. An example would be if you needed something 3.5 feet long and you were trying to actually joint a face, and that's the tool that we use on 8-footer, it doesn't make any sense. If you can make it smaller and narrower, then it's much easier to work with that piece of wood.
Okay.
So the ripping and cross-cutting and the inspecting of the wood, that kind of comes, second. And the third one would be where you're actually what we call facing a board. So you take it to the joiner, you take the widest portion of the board, and you actually run it over a tool that, for want of a better term, makes the first fully flat plane. The actual name of the tool is misleading because it's used to joint edges of boards. But really, the first thing is you flatten the face of the board. Once that's flattened, you go to another tool.
Okay.
Another tool is a surface planer.
Surface planer.
And then surface planers, most of the time, the planer head is on the top. So that freshly jointed, flattened surface goes down.
Okay.
And then on the top, that planer will take off and parallel that first surface. And then after it comes out, you'll flip it around and go through again and bring it to your desired thickness, always flipping it. And the reason that we're flipping it, if you imagine the thickness of a piece of wood, if we did everything off of one surface, we would have a center that might be wetter or drier than the outside portions of the wood. So you're always flipping it to make sure that you've got kind of an even moisture content.
Maximize your stability in the finished product.
As much as you can.
Love that.
And believe me, even after we're going through all these steps, it can still move. So the concept is you always mill it to a little bit larger until you need to mill it. Final.
Okay.
And you're going to install it or you're going to build something with it or whatever. So at any rate, now you have surfaced two sides, S2S.
Okay.
But both edges are still rough.
Okay.
Okay?
And they technically could be random width at this stage.
Yeah, exactly.
Too. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So
Then I would bring it over to the jointer again, and the jointer has a fence. And we set the fence at 90 degrees standard. You can also do some beveling work on it, but most of the time it's set to 90 degrees. And I would run that piece of wood over that to make a 90-degree edge. So now I have surfaced three sides, one edge and two faces.
okay.
Then from there, and this, a lot of students don't understand this, what they'll do is they'll flip it over and joint the fourth side or the fourth pass. But the problem is if you have a board that's shaped and it's not parallel, you got a problem. So we go over to the table saw, we make it parallel.
Okay.
We still have S3S because it's a sawn edge now.
Oh, it's not as nice as that jointed edge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we go back over, run a light pass on the jointer, and you have S4S. Then you would go and cut it to length.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know from talking to you in the past and hearing more about these tools, there's definitely safety concerns that's primary with all your students. Could you touch a little bit on that? And then maybe also, are there limitations as to how much you would ever even want to try to take off in a given pass? And maybe that's species specific. Maybe if it's a really super hardwood versus poplar, can I take off a 1/4 inch on the jointer with poplar and 1/8 inch on Ipe, or is there rules of thumb or
Nope, that's a good
uses?
question. With Ipe, take off a 30-second maybe,
Okay.
because you're dealing with ironwood there. But you're right, the species can drive it. But a lot of times it's the surfacing. If you remember that 2x4 I showed you in one of our earlier segments, if it's very, very rough, then you can set the infeed table for a pretty good cut, maybe even 1/8 of an inch, because it's going to sound like because it's not going to be hitting everywhere.
Gotcha.
But as it gets flatter and flatter, you want to take less material off. The standard for us is somewhere between a 16th and a 32nd at a pass. Right. Now, if I have a lot of people working for me and we're doing like I'm a door shop or something, and there's a lot of material getting put over there, I want to take off the maximum that I can so I don't have quite so many passes. It's going to be a lot more labor to do that. But that also depends on the condition of the wood. If you got any steep grain run out, then at that point you're going to have to take a light pass and you're going to have to slow it down. The jointer really does require some artistry, but there are all sorts of assistive devices, from push pads, push blocks, push sticks, that will help keep your hands away from the knives.
Gotcha.
On a table saw, obviously we can have it guarded, and again, all of our tools are all saw stopped, so we feel better about that. We still treat it as if it wasn't a saw stop and there was no there was no flesh sensing technology.
Okay.
But on a jointer, that size of that cutter head, you're right, that's a problem. The other limitation is after you get past an 8-inch jointer, you get into some very serious tooling that's very, very expensive. Say
Okay.
18 or 21-inch jointer, whereas an 18-inch planer is not that bad on your pocketbook.
All right. Well, Dave, once again, I'm really glad that we did this episode. That was very, very informative.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.